setting the scene, security behaviors in organizations, we've been talking about it a lot today. These human-facing security initiatives, they're increasingly leveraging behavior change approaches. We've seen today mention of things like motivation and capability. And staff training is an example, how best to make a password, manage your credentials. Phishing has been mentioned, of course, just very recently in the last talk. So anti-phishing training, but also data sharing. How do you work with people in the same organization? What tools should you use? How do you work with others? What should you share? And there is the training, but there's also the infrastructure ought to support the behavior change for it to be sustainable. That's to say that you may get lots of motivation. People want to actually work securely. That's the goal, to be able to do your work, but do it securely. But then how do we keep that going over time? And when I was working with the colleagues on this work, we saw these kind of contradictions in how security behaviors in organizations are managed, but also how the support, the training, the availability of tools, which was also discussed today, how are these managed as well? And we made sense of this by consolidating traditional and behavioral economics. Behavioral economics, of course, very useful for behavior change. And it's at the root of this is that training information is, or the kind of prompt to work securely is provided as if employees need that information. But then some of that information is missed as to how to actually do the secure work. So it may look more like a prompt, but it also skips a decision on the choices for how to actually situate security, which is to say, you've told me how to do the security, but have you given me the information to actually fit this in to my work day? Because the overarching thing here is that security is there to support your work. So then we're thinking here that employees need enough information to decide how to actually fit security into their work. That's the last word, their work. So the kind of headlines from this work, but also to keep myself on track, is we were seeing these opportunities emerging from these contradictions, where first it's flipping around this assumption that we focus on making things more usable, so that the cost for the employee to follow the behaviors, to manage their passwords, to look at phishing emails, it's less. But what assumptions are we making about the value of what people are doing with their day, that we assume they can fit this into their work? So it seems to help in planning, but also it feels more respectful to assume that employees are already busy all day. And so then, well, if they have no more time, how do we fit security in? And yet, employees fit security in with their productive tasks. How are they doing that? How do we inform those decisions? And can we actually learn from that? And there's been a long body of work now for several years about how we can actually engage with employees to understand how they're doing that and learn from it. And there's already been discussion today in a few of the talks about how to manage the communication about security. But again, with the economics angle, I'll get to this, is it's this manufactured security relationship. In an organization, you have the recognized security experts and non-experts, and how are we supporting the relationship between those two? So the aim of the research that we did, as in the paper there, led by Albesa, we were revisiting the principles of traditional economics and behavioral economics together to actually understand, well, how much of each side is being represented in the way security is being managed, because we're seeing that employees have constraints on the time or knowledge that they have about security because they are the non-expert in the organization. So how can we improve the positioning of information, show the usability of tools, but reduce those costs so then there's better support for good enough security-related decisions given those constraints. So to actually make that more concrete, we can almost imagine that this line between the two sides is where we were seeing this contradiction, that we have this rational agent, it's how it's referred to in traditional economics is someone who just knows everything. They know the optimal decision for themselves. And more from behavioral economics, the bounded agent who has limited resources and limited information and knowledge. And so what we might see in typical training, communications with staff is, well, you have insufficient skills and knowledge. We must tell you what you should do. So have a secure password. Okay, so how do I do that? How do I have a secure password? Be vigilant when you're assessing phishing emails. And we saw examples of where does, in the last talk, of where does a novice look? Where does an expert look? Is someone going to tell me what I should be looking at or looking for? And certainly more so when someone has their work that they're also trying to do. We don't all just go to work to do security tasks. Is you're going to have limited resources, but you're going to be making this brief consideration of the costs to your time, to your work, and the gains you're going to get, that nice feeling of doing secure work. And then, as I say, there's these insufficient skills, the manufactured or the deliberate difference in between the security function and the employees. And so what we're seeing as, I guess, more likely is that in organizations, someone under pressure to do their work and also follow security advice may well be making a satisfactory decision based on this quick evaluation, brief considerations, and the limited information they have, not necessarily the optimal decision where, for instance, if it's a phishing email, they'd know everything and know already instantly that it's actually malicious. So as I said, the first assumption that we thought we would have to challenge is the relative cost of doing security. So we typically approach the cost of security in terms of justifying the ask. We say security is important. And having been involved in a lot of usability research myself, we're looking at how to make things more usable. How do we minimize those costs? But there's still a cost. And also if we're trying to justify it as this is for security, and this was touched on in talks earlier in the day, is, well, security is important. So that justifies the cost. It's like, well, but the cost is still there. How do I fit this into a already busy day? So it becomes a different challenge if we actually respect that employees are busy all day, which already raises questions about what assumptions are we making about what employees do with their day. So then there's a need to plan where those necessary resources will come from. And looking again at economics, there would be a loss aversion among employees in the sense of, I have this time to do my work, and then I've got to find that time to do security. So it's not only do my work, but I've got to find the time to follow security tasks, like I want to look carefully at these emails to make sure I don't fall for a phishing email. but I've got to take that time from somewhere else. And I've seen examples with some companies where there'll be onboarding training, and that's actually blocked out for the new starters as actual paid time. But that seems rare as far as I can tell. And we see this kind of informally as well. There might be an email going out saying there is refresher training, or you've got to look out for this particular threat, things like that. There'll be some awareness that extra time might be needed to carefully look at emails, things like that. But to ask employees for their time and not have a sense of how much it's costing can create dilemmas, especially for the conscientious employees who are busy with their work, but they're also trying to follow all the policies, because they'll be under pressure to kind of do more of that work. And if we aren't keeping track of how much effort, time is required for security, it may actually create more opportunities for errors. And that's the kind of thing that some phishing emails exploit. So for instance, the last talk was talking about issues within the phishing attack, essentially. But what are the qualities of the workplace and the work conditions as well? And for instance, with anti-phishing activities, it may require checking all emails because, again, with incomplete knowledge, you might have lots of genuine emails, but you're still checking them to see if they are genuine or not. So then what is that ask in reality, and how many emails are employees actually getting? That they then have to sift through all of them to make sure that whether they're genuine or not. So as I said, an example for negotiating time for workplace security, maybe for onboarding training, but it could be also considered for regular training. But then I've researched smaller organizations where there was one that they would, in essence, take their Friday afternoon to carefully go through all their emails to make sure that they weren't going to click on something horrible. So there may well be opportunities to support the planning of secure working practices. In a sense, so the workplace security is less ad hoc. In what I mean is that, again, it's referring to an employee may wish to work securely, but then it's kind of left to them to figure out how to fit it in. Like I'm thinking of these kind of, I don't know, maybe an absurd situation where an employee says to their manager, like, "Oh, I didn't meet the deadline for submitting that bid for the multi-million-pound project." "Oh, why?" I was very carefully looking through my emails to check that there weren't any phishing emails then. So, "Oh, it's all right. We'll go for the next one." It doesn't quite work like that. But so then thinking of that one, it's like, well, can we negotiate that? There's maybe blocked off time where you can carefully check through your day's emails. Things like this. But is there, and again, referring to the discussions of elements of authority that we've seen earlier today, can someone else negotiate for employees that they have that time and they don't have to do that negotiating themselves? They're asking for extra time to work securely because it does have costs. And with the way the world might be going, we might have to do more and more for security. So that's to say, I don't think these costs are necessarily going to go away. And the way I'm thinking about this is it kind of highlights this tension between security of the whole system, but then also, are we achieving security for what employees do within that system? So, because ultimately, the best way to secure the whole system is to turn your computer off, set it in concrete, and throw it out the window. But you need to do your work. So how can we be secure and do the work? And referring to the title of the talk, how can we then support an employee as a decision maker to make it clearer what the ask is, what is being asked, for instance, to make a secure password, to check your emails thoroughly, but also, so here, advice activities, it may, as I said, it's like if we think about those different models of economics, if employees already knew how to do things, you wouldn't, and they had full system knowledge, you wouldn't have to tell them how to do something, they'd already know how to do it. So there can be advice activities which, as I say, they act more like a prompt, thinking about behavior change, to have secure passwords, to make sure your computer is up to date, but then may leave the employees to guess about those unfamiliar tasks. So if they haven't, for instance, if an employee hasn't used the workplace computer before, they don't know all the menus, they might click around, say, oh, I think, I've had a look, I haven't got time, I'll just presume that my computer is up to date. But then I start to think even more, I guess, in basic terms around these things, like use secure passwords. Should I do that right now? Keep your computer up to date. Should I do it now? When do I do that? How do I do that? And so there's this term satisficing, where you've put in your limited resources and you don't have any more resources, but you think you've done a good enough job of checking. So then, again, this relates to how do we weave security in with those workplace activities, the primary tasks, because security tasks interact with those non-security tasks. And it's, again, this is another, perhaps it's a bias and assumption, they interact in a non-trivial way. It's not that necessarily you can say we must work securely and it's doable. Again, I was thinking of one of the talks in the morning, it's not that this plea for secure behavior carries enough authority to make everything work. We've got to, the employee still has to try and fit these things in. And so, as I say, we're considering employees here as these bounded rationality, bounded security decision makers. So can we actually supply information to inform where to commit those times and resources if they are limited? Because having worked in human factors usable security for 15 odd years now, there's a lot of research focusing on, say, how to do the behavior. But then when I contrasted that in the paper here with how, for instance, business leaders are looked at, it's like they have complex decisions to make, but employees also, those who are given the behaviors to enact, they have complex decisions to make as well in terms of how they actually fit that in, especially with their work. So I'm thinking of even simple examples, like someone might say, well, my last meeting ended early. I would do that update that I think I got an email about. I would install that on my work computer if I knew it would be done before my next meeting. If I had that information to say, it's going to take 15 minutes. It's definitely going to take 15 minutes. It's not going to be one of those surprise updates that hangs for half an hour and leaves you wondering if it's broken. It's definitely going to take that amount of time. Then it may be easier to fit these things in. And this model's been referred to a few times already today, I think. The COM-B model. And where I found this interesting to relate to employee security is thinking as well in terms of James Clear's atomic habits, that if you make a behavior difficult, you're essentially de-emphasizing it. even if you actually intended that to be a behavior that you want to see happening. So as much as this is called a behavior change model, it seems useful as well as a behavior preservation model. What qualities do you want to keep for a behavior so that it can keep going? So if a secure behavior is affecting the comparable elements of a work task, it's going to make it more difficult to do. And as I say, it's a kind of call to work securely, or that security is important. That may act on the motivation, but that in itself doesn't make you know how to do it. I don't think I've seen that happen. That someone's, we must be secure. We must work securely. It's like, I know how to make a secure password now, directly because of you having said that. Again, doesn't work like that. But it's that interaction between security behaviors and productive behaviors, primary task behaviors, and how do we actually manage those together. But then again, in other work, more recently, we saw that there are already the tools to be able to manage all of these things together in existing risk management standards. It's a bit of a difficult ask in the sense of we may have a risk register, but again, thinking of security of and security for, may we in essence have a behavior register of the behaviors we're wanting to make sure we maintain in the system, and how can we make sure those can happen without, for instance, employees having to figure out how to fit them in themselves. And this relates also to unintended harms, which is an element of behavior change programs as well. We're trying to make sure we don't have negative side effects. But it requires coordination with non-security teams, and this really speaks to how IT and security are interlinked with so much of what goes on in organizations these days. But as I said, there are many risk management standards like Octave, for instance, which consider the impacts of new security controls on the effectiveness of existing security controls and include engagement with business stakeholders to make sure they provide security, but then can we ask if there are impacts on business objectives as well, which is also an aspect of some of these risk management standards. So when I say we would want to negotiate that employees don't have to lose time from primary tasks and have to negotiate this themselves, we may be able to leverage existing approaches from risk management standards to actually do that as well and entrench that in an organization. And so then, how might we actually understand how we address this information asymmetry as well between the security team and employees? Again, just to echo that we would hope for support for users so that they can effectively adopt behaviors. But one thing I find interesting with, as I say, this managed information asymmetry is it goes both ways. We may be asking employees to understand more and more about how to do security. Do we want them to become an actual security expert in their own right? Or do we want them to know when to hand over to an expert? But also, does the security team know how people do their work? And again, the time, the resources required for those tasks. And accepting that that goes beyond the remit perhaps of the security manager or the security team to know how everyone else works. What are the approaches here? So, as I say here, it's what we might do is find where decisions are being made to try and fit security in with these limited resources, which I'll get to in these slides as well. But it's this thing that, again, saying security is important won't make a pressing deadline go away. But can we actually, and it's again been mentioned, it's great that all these sort of interactions or overlaps between the talks today, is the communication of information to employees that, again, this kind of absurd thought. It's not like people wake up every day and go like, my policy sense is tingling. There's new advice which is relevant to me, and now I know it. It's again, it's not this perfect knowledge environment. We won't know instantaneously when new information is or what it is, and we want to be able to reduce that satisficing, or when satisficing happens, more specifically, thinking about good enough decisions, that when those limited resources are applied, that it's more likely the decision maker, the employee, has got the right information. And then there's less guesswork, especially if there is negotiation about, can I have the time to update my work computer? Then they might know how long it's going to take, for instance. I think I've managed to skip a slide there. Never mind. So a worked example would be keeping software up to date. I've mentioned it already. So what would be great is if we knew we had particular installations, several different kinds of installations of computers within the workplace, that we could map our advice specifically to those devices. You have this particular operating system, this particular version. We know you've got these particular applications installed by default. So then we have those specifications, manage the asymmetries there. So not just test that it works, but actually that it's not going to break anything that was important for people's work. And also inform those costs, the sense of costs and gains and losses. So state actually when an update would have to happen, what's actually going to change, how long it's going to take. And again, a call to usability is provide only these viable options, because time to update is time not working. There's been examples of legal cases in the past where employees were arguing, well, the time I need to turn the power on and wait for the computer to fully start up is work time. And the employer would say, no, you can go and make a cup of tea or something. It's fine, but they were still having to come in early to do it. So it's actually useful to know the costs to actually plan around it. As I say, you may have the time to actually install the update, and then design those resilient choices, the ones that can work over time. I say that because in behavioral economics, there's this idea of the choice architecture, but some of that may well be constructed from the employee side, because not updating could be an option. So it's how do we actually make that seem like it's not so much that that's not the ideal option, but that updating the computer actually provides or acts as a better option. And that's actually understanding not just the actual costs in terms of time, but those perceived costs as well. So someone might think, well, I'm not going to install this update because it's going to mess with my applications. Because when we talk about security updates, for instance, they're actually hidden away in feature updates or alongside them. And it might be that the user is actually more concerned about the feature updates that mess around with their menus than the security updates. So some operating systems, for instance, separate those out. And again, thinking about who has the power over security behaviors is the collective decisions. So is there an information cascade that you must install updates, or you must take time to check your emails? So here, updates get non-negotiable updates, which are kind of pushed out. Do we know what effect that's going to have on people's work? And again, thinking about those information asymmetries, are we pushing an update out when actually there's lots of project deadlines coming up, and it's can we balance those somehow? When is a good time to actually do these things? And as well, there's a good example from a recent NCSC blog post, actually looking at a more socio-technical approach to phishing measures, anti-phishing measures, which I liked. So it's another example of smoothing the path, taking the efforts out of the employee decision-making process and doing a lot of things in the background as well. So those opportunities again. Can we address loss aversion and actually appreciate that employees are busy all day doing work, but also they may want to do security, so they're actually having to try and negotiate with the rest of the organization to find time for it? Can we inform the decisions about how an employee would fit security into that busy day? It's not that this respect for security overrides the primary task. And it may be that employees learn from trying to balance security and productivity. And can we learn from that rather than necessarily stamp it out? We can learn from that through dialogues between security and the rest of the organization. Again, how do we manage that information asymmetry? And again, how do we position support in the right places to reduce the cost of finding it? Because then these costs then add up. It's the employees doing their primary task. They want to do security well. They want to negotiate the time to add security into their day. It's not cost-free, but then there's also the cost of trying to find the advice as well. And the ongoing research is actually examining the benefits and costs of these approaches of, say, understanding the user, the employee requirements more. How do those benefits and costs of following these approaches relate to what security is expected to deliver? So I think that was the last slide.
Questions? So there's one here. I think we need to use another mic, so we'll just hold on 1 second.
Hi, thanks very much. That was really interesting. You focused an awful lot on cost.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't feel like you looked very much at increasing the value proposition or increasing the benefit, the perceived benefit of security, because I found that that's a way that you can actually help with prioritization. If both the individual and the organization agree that security has value, then it's still a prioritization tool, but it becomes, it actually increases the chance that they will take those secure behaviors more seriously.
It's not an issue of taking it more seriously. It might be they already take it seriously, and we could argue that's why there's lots of interest in this notion of a security culture, where essentially everyone agrees that the costs are worth absorbing, but the costs of actually doing it are still there. So that they may agree with the benefits, but it doesn't make more time.
Sure, but there's a cost to opening a new market. There's a cost to investing in new equipment. Everything has a cost, not just security.
Yeah.
And so I think the benefit argument, what will this do for our organisation if we are more secure? What will it do for you as an individual if you understand security? Is one that I didn't really hear coming out of what you were saying.
Yeah, it is. I guess I was presuming the benefits of security are plain, but so maybe that I should have stated that as well. But it's this difficult situation that if working securely, of course there is benefit to secure working. If those costs are non-trivial, we do have this difficulty of how do we fit all of this in, and yeah, there's a need. I see there being a need to perhaps, as we say, like measure the time, the effort, because what we don't want is that, because I alluded to like the conscientious employee who does recognize the value of doing security, but also the value of doing their job, and they're trying to do everything, and it's not that trying to do everything is without harm either, because it might be they try and do everything and they get so, I mean, that's the kind of thing phishing attacks would exploit, is that you're busy, you're distracted. But it's how would the organization decide to manage those costs as they mount? But no, I agree that security, of course, has its value as well.
Great, thank you. And then there's one question behind. Oh, sorry.
Hello. Yes, so my question actually is kind of a little bit like an observation. And how do you see this in a hybrid working environments or remote environments? Because you're not anymore constrained by the building and the physical security and the workplace, but you're actually transferring yourself between these places, plus all the public locations as well, like cafes and WeWorks and all that. How can it... did it come up in your research at all, that kind of need to do that? And whose responsibility is it then? Like, is it employee thinks that, okay, responsibility for workplace information is workplace, it's IT, it's security, it's the organization, whereas if it's their personal information, it's like, I'm the responsible. So there's kind of two questions there. So how did that come out in your research and what you looked at?
So thinking back to some of the studies I've been involved in over the years, even before the lockdown and lockdown measures, one way that security was providing benefits was for if remote working was set up, and then indeed you save on travel time, things like that. But when you say hybrid, that essentially means that's two infrastructures that have to be managed at the same time, which sometimes gets forgotten. But having spoken with, for instance, small business IT providers, they might say, well, to remove the confusion about how to work securely remotely, perhaps it's good to get data plans for your staff, and then they know they just use that, and then they don't have to figure out how to work securely in like a cafe or something like that. The option is there, and they just have to think, for instance, do I use my data plan, as opposed to, can I glean something from the limited information I have about this cafe's Wi-Fi to figure out if I should use it.
So yeah, it's basically the organization then providing usable tools and methods to safely work in hybrid environments as well, and not just within the organization. Mm-hmm. Cool, thanks.
Hi, so one of the things that, again, it's a little bit more of an observation of, especially this conversation you were having about cost and time and respecting the employee, which is fantastic because a lot of bigger companies forget that, it's built upon the individual employees within, is this idea that making time for security should be important, which it should be, and we all know it should be, especially with things leading more online these days. But in reality, we shouldn't be making more time for security. We should be incorporating security into our existing time. But my question for you would be more around something slightly different, and looking at it that employees, and considering something which we had discussing this morning with things like accessibility, for example, how would you respect the employee to ensure a sort of equilibrium of sort of balance, in that one employee might need 5 minutes of training to understand phishing emails. Another employee might need 50 minutes of training, for example. And then saying to the companies, that's fine, yeah, give one employee the 5 minutes, one employee the 50 minutes. But then the employee that only needed 5 minutes might feel a bit disgruntled about, well, I've now got 45 minutes more of work that I need to do, whereas they've got 50 minutes of cyber training, and it's making sure that balance. And I can see you pulling a bit of a confused face. The way that I'm trying to sort of explain it in my
That's
mind
just my face.
The way I'm sort of trying to sort of understand it in my mind, and please, nobody take offence to this, but smoking breaks, for example, there was a big thing about smokers being able to go out and have 5-10 minutes of a break as much as they want, whenever they want throughout the day, and then companies insisted on putting in, you get a 10-minute break in the morning, a 10-minute break in the afternoon. But employees kicked up a fuss because non-smokers didn't get that break. So it's ensuring that not only do you make sure that the time for security is built into the time that you give your employees, but that time is balanced and fair.
Yeah. That was indeed something I was thinking about, because coming from the angle of usability, I would like it that we measure how much time security takes and do something to reduce that. But it's not only to make things easier for the employee, it's again this concern that if this is unchecked, then we might just be lucky that it hasn't all added up to a confusing mess of tasks, and people are getting confused trying to fit everything in. So indeed it would be useful to measure the training time to at least give people some time to do it. So maybe talking between those extremes of 5 and 50 minutes, I'm going to make a simple comment that it could be like, well, we'll give them something in between and then ask them, was that enough time, or were you finished really early, or do you need more time? But at least try and keep track of it. But also, if security is important, keeping track that the security is done, as opposed to it's important, figure out how to do it.
I get it, especially because for me as well, I build PCs. I'm a massive nerd. I'm a massive gamer. Personally, I absolutely detest my work laptop. I use a lot of my own devices with my own security VPNs and everything set up at home to do a lot of my work on, because the work laptop is a lot slower and things like that. So it's looking at making sure that when you're considering including the time for security in the employment time, it's also including making sure that we have this cost and effect balance, that we have decent tools and decent resources to do it. I mean, my laptop for work can take a good 20 minutes to boot up. That's, at least 3 or 4 cups of tea. So,
yeah. Yeah, but I guess it's, as I said earlier, it's easy to think that if it's important and we're reducing the cost of security, you can fit it in somewhere. But that relies heavily on a presumption that you in your day, there's time when you're not doing anything as important as security. So then that's why people will do their training over their lunch break, things like that. So it's not easy to fix, but it's something to be keeping track of.